So if you guys have been around my channel long enough, you know that I love the GH5. I even got my start back in the GH4 days. I've pretty much never used or even definitely not owned a full frame camera before now. Yes, I finally broke down and bought myself my own personal choice, being the Panasonic S5. Now you should also know that I really love the Leica 10-25. Got it right here. And I recently got lucky and picked up a used Lumix 24-70 f2.8 for the S5. In my opinion, these are the two premier standard zooms for each system, especially for videographers. They are obviously very different lenses though, and from very different cameras. Either way, for myself, for you guys, everyone out there, I wanted to put these cameras and lenses to their respective tests and see which one is better, the S5 with the more traditional 24-70, or the GH5 and the very unique Leica 10-25. So, which lens and camera combination is right for me or right for you? Let's check it out. These lenses are not cheap, so if you aren't already, please hit the subscribe button. It's totally free, unlike these two lenses, which unfortunately are not. Anyway, back to the video. Speaking of, let's look at pricing before anything else to give us context for each of these systems. The GH5 these days comes in at around $1,400, which is kind of an insanely good price if you think about it. And the Leica 10-25 here is actually going to be more expensive than the camera at around $1,800, which if you watch this video here, I proved that that's actually pretty good value for your money. The S5 new is about $2K flat out, and once you factor in the lens, again, it's more expensive than the body, coming at $2,200. That leaves us with the GH5 combo at around $3,200 and the S5 and 24-70 at around $4,200, or just about exactly $1,000 more. So I would usually do the build quality here, since these are two different lenses on two different cameras on two different size sensors. I really wanted to get some of the basic specs out of the way first, mainly the zoom range and aperture differences, which I think are going to be some of the biggest deciding factors for most people. So for the money, what do you get here? Well, for that we got to do some super fun crop factor math. If you don't care about this stuff or already know, feel free to check out the chapter markers or down in the description or whatever. But if you want a quick refresher or don't know, definitely keep watching. First, the full frame equivalent. The GH5 and Leica 10-25 effectively gives you a 20 to 50 millimeter lens with a decently wide aperture of f3.5, but remember, that only accounts for background blur. The actual light transmission to the sensor is still an f1.7, which might give the GH5 an edge in low light. Not a sentence I ever thought I was going to say. So basically, we're going to test this later, but theoretically, the S5 at f2.8 should be at around 3200 ISO in this situation. The GH5 should be able to come in at something like 1250 ISO, which is a pretty big difference if I did the math right. So we'll see later on if the bigger dual gain sensor could be better even with a slower lens and low light. Next, I want to talk about the range of these two lenses. In terms of the overall range, the Leica has a 2.5 times zoom range, which is pretty respectable for what it is. For example, it's better than the Sigma 18-35, which provides actually a less than 2 times zoom range. But the classic 24-70 range ends up being a 2.9 times zoom range, which will, in theory, allow you to be a little bit more flexible in some shooting conditions, but not all. There are certainly times where 24 millimeters isn't wide enough, like in this pool area where 24 millimeters doesn't exactly capture the whole space, but 20 millimeters on the GH5 does. Conversely, a 70 millimeter is a decent bit more zoomed in than 50 millimeters, wandering into a short telephoto or portrait range just out of that standard view of 50 millimeters. Just like sometimes I can't back up far enough for a 24 millimeter to capture an entire scene, at other events like weddings, 50 millimeters just isn't tight enough to get that emotion I want from a first dance or something along those lines. I have to say though, generally, for most of what I do, I can usually get a little closer to my subjects if I need to, even at wedding situations most of the time, whereas some rooms are only so big, and that 20mm full frame equivalent has saved me on more than a few occasions. I think the 10-25 is super unique as a lens and has a range that is one of the things that made me choose it over the Sigma 18-35 originally back in the day, and why in certain situations I'll still be choosing the GH5 over the newer S5. Still, that 24-70 range is a classic for a reason, and you personally might enjoy that range more. So at the end of the day, I think it's kind of a toss-up, and I think you're either going to want to rent some of these lenses and gear to test them out, or you already know. So first off, I think we're going to take a look at what they do similarly before we take a look at what they do differently. Obviously, they're both weather sealed, splash, dust, freeze proof, all that sort of stuff. They both have the manual focus clutches, both the 10-25 and the 24-70. Both reveal a distance scale as well under it. I don't know how useful that is, but it is nice. Both of them do extend when they zoom, but that is a little bit different. So the 24-70, like usual, is collapsed at the wide end and zooms in as you go to 70, right? But the 10-25, on the other hand, is about the most collapsed at maybe 13mm. If you zoom out to 10, it extends just a bit, and if you zoom out to 25, it extends a bit more, but it's pretty much always going to be shorter than the 24-70, which is quite a bit longer at the wide end and quite a bit longer at the telephoto end as well. And so the 10-25 is definitely a more compact lens. It's also lighter too, despite being made of mostly metal, where this seems to be metal and plastic and of course rubber too. So yeah, the 10-25 more compact, the 24-70 a little bit bulkier, but I think that makes sense given the formats. They both have pretty big front filters. We got 77, we got 82, and you know, it kind of just is what it is on that one. They're both completely weather sealed, gaskets at the back, really great build quality. Now, a couple differences. So, 10-25, it has this aperture ring, which can be really handy. You can switch this to A to go back to in-camera controls, but you can also go to the smooth clickless aperture going from f1.7 to f16. That's really great and can really help you manually change your exposure if you ever need to, or really just dial it in if you want like f1.9, for example. You can do it on this lens, so that's pretty handy. The 24-70 has no aperture ring. You can still control the aperture in the camera like always. It's just not going to be as precise, although when you are recording, it is going to be a smooth transition, so that is nice. I will say there is a difference in the zoom ring on these lenses as well. The 10-25, you can get very smooth results, don't get me wrong. But you can also zoom really quickly and really easily with just like a single finger. This is really great for when I've got this on a gimbal. I can really easily zoom this thing without a lot of resistance, but just enough resistance. I don't know. I think that is valuable because I can be smooth when I want to, and I can do a really fast crash zoom if I needed to, although I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, which we'll talk about that later. And then you've got the 24-70 here, and it's got a very nice, very smooth zoom ring. I think I even prefer this rubber over the metal of this lens, but the thing with this is you can't really zoom it quickly, you know, like it's got a lot of resistance, it's got a lot of stuff to move, and it's just, you got to really put a lot of work into, you know, moving this focus ring. So yeah, I kind of do find that on a gimbal, this is a little hard to use because I do zoom on a gimbal to reframe. So that is just one thing you're going to have to, or at least that you should consider between these two lenses. Okay, and now for the all-important ASMR focus clutch enabling test. So here's the 10-25 enabling the clutch focus. And the 24-70.
So yeah, for this very important test, let me know which one do you guys think is more satisfying, because I play with these things all the time. The Leica is a little harder to pull back, but it's got a bit of a more like bassy, kind of satisfying feeling. But there's just like a whip of this and the ease of it, and the fact that it makes a different noise one way or the other. I don't know. This is a tough one for me. I'm gonna have to think on this one. So you guys tell me below, which clutch do you think looks or sounds more satisfying? Let me know. Neither of these lenses have image stabilization. They kind of are just stabilized by the in-body image stabilization, and neither have any kind of switches or anything like that along them. This is a Leica lens. This lens says it is certified by Leica, which, you know, that's kind of what I thought these lenses were, you know, certified by Leica. That's really it. Maybe they're designed, who knows? No one really knows. But yeah, so in terms of build quality, both pretty similar with a couple notable differences.
So I really hate when people make these type of videos and don't do a simple parfocal analysis. A lens being parfocal is one of the most important things to me and to a lot of videographers, and so we make sure to test that here on the channel. Good news, this is going to be a pretty easy and quick section for once. Both lenses are effectively parfocal. I don't think they are optically parfocal, but they do hold focus as you zoom in and out on your subject really pretty well. In fact, I've seen no flickering of any kind, exposure or focus. So yeah, in practice, these lenses are both perfect for those who sometimes want to or need to reframe the shot by zooming in or out at a live event or wedding, for example. Okay, so this is a video-centric review for some pretty video-centric lenses, so this is gonna be nice and quick as well. Both lenses are amazingly sharp across the frame, pretty much every focal length. The 10-25 has been said to have some slight field curvature, but I've never really been able to see any evidence of it. Honestly, no complaints for sharpness when it comes to photos, and definitely when it comes to video, where 4K and above is going to be perfectly fine for these lenses. So chromatic aberration on your subject is pretty much going to be 0 for these lenses. They are corrected in camera, in JPEGs, RAWs, and video for vignetting, distortion, and yes, chromatic aberration. What is much more difficult is longitudinal chromatic aberration, where you can see some CA type stuff on things just in front of and just out of the plane of focus. I will say the 10-25 has slightly more of that in the out of focus areas than the 24-70. Honestly though, in 99% of situations, you'll be hard pressed to see any evidence of this on either lens. Okay, there's a few things I forgot to test on camera we're gonna knock out real quick. First is the ease of focusing that I usually do, ease of manual focus. So the fly-by-wire on both of these lenses on the newest bodies, like the GH5 Mark II, the S5, can be programmed even in fly-by-wire mode to be linear, and you can program the degrees from, I think, as low as 45 to as high as 360, or maybe even more. So in that regard, they end up pretty even, although I haven't actually tested firsthand the GH5 Mark II linear focus. The manual focus clutch is pretty much the same story. They both are about the same degrees of travel. They both turn just about as smoothly. In general, I think the fly-by-wire and the clutches on these lenses work pretty much the same. On the subject of focusing, we're going to look at the focus breathing of these two lenses, and once again, you can see why I didn't test this. They're both pretty much perfect. At the wide end, no focus breathing. Zooming in, very little focus breathing. I think anybody, even on a film set, would be pretty happy with the performance of these lenses on this category. All right, let's rip off the Band-Aid here. The Leica 10-25 is vastly superior to the Lumix 24-70 when it comes to shooting close-ups of relatively small objects. At 10 millimeters, the minimum focus is really pretty close on the Leica, and I think that macro type wide angle shot is pretty interesting when it comes to the perspective it gives you, especially for something like product shots. The Lumix though is actually shockingly bad at 24 millimeters at least, giving you this type of perspective. To be clear, for larger subjects or people, this is totally fine, but for smaller objects or product photos, this can actually be a pretty limiting factor. You'd need to crop this image around 200% to even come close to matching the up-close performance of the Leica 10-25. The Leica at 25mm focuses slightly further away than at 10mm, but still lets you get a super decent close-up that is actually a larger reproduction due to the longer focal length. Nice. The Lumix at its longest focal length of 70mm does a much more decent job here than it does at 24mm, but still doesn't get quite as close as the Leica does. You only need to crop about 30% this time to match the size of the subject. Still, the Leica wins this category pretty easily. Honestly, I kind of like that the 24-70 here is parfocal and the minimum focus distance is the same. Even if that does hurt the close-up ability of the lens at the wider angles just a little bit, it prevents anything weird happening when zooming in and out on smaller subjects. So bokeh is a tough subject with these lenses because we have to admit that the Lumix 24-70 will always have blurry backgrounds at equivalent focal lengths with both lenses wide open. Like we talked about earlier, the 10-25 has the blurry backgrounds of a full-frame 20-50 at f3.5, where obviously the 24-70 is a 24-70 2.8. Or if we flip that occasion for the Micro Four Thirds users out there, the S5 is like having a 12-35 f1.4 lens when it comes to blurry backgrounds, which one would be super awesome, but would be super huge and way more expensive than the 10-25. Anyway, we're going to try to ignore most of that, maybe keep it in the back of your mind, but instead of looking at the amount of blurry backgrounds, try to look at just the quality of them. So at 10mm, the bokeh on the Leica is decent enough. In the middle, there's a slight rough texture on the bokeh highlights that I think comes mostly from the lens flare coatings, but nothing too terrible. Towards the edge, the bokeh does experience some odd mechanical vignetting, creating what in your pictures will come out as the sort of pinched triangular bokeh in the corners of your image. Going into 25mm, you see that texture a little bit more, as well as a few other interesting things. The first being that cat's eye or football shape towards the edge of the frame. Most lenses have some level of this wide open, and I tend not really to mind it. The other two things would be the slight outlining of the bokeh highlights, which there is, but it's not too terrible, and on occasion a slight green ring around the bokeh balls as well. That comes from, I think, the chromatic aberration stuff we looked at earlier. At the widest angle, the bokeh on the 24-70 is again pretty good overall, but you get a similar vignetting problem when the highlights are on the edge of the frame. This time, the lens barrel simply cuts off the inside and outsides of the bokeh ball, making it look kind of squished. Zooming in at 50mm and then at 70mm, we see a few notable differences to the 10-25. The cat's eye effect on this lens is actually controlled much better than on the 10-25, and the bokeh remains really pretty round throughout the range. As far as that texture inside the bokeh goes, it's much more of the classic circular onion ring pattern this time compared to that even sort of grainy texture of the 10-25. I'm also noticing that the highlighting rings around the edges are a little bit more pronounced, which can cause your bokeh in some situations to look a little busier. Before we stop the lens down, let's look at our macro tests for a little bit more information in a slightly more practical situation. Pretty much just confirms all our findings. The cat's eye effect on the 10-25 is much greater than the 24-70, but the Lumix does display way more outlining on the bokeh, and in this situation, the bokeh actually has some kind of weird chromatic aberration on the sides of the highlights. Maybe because it's at the minimum focus distance? Anyway, it's red on one side, blue on the other, whereas on the Leica 10-25, it's green, but not nearly as bad either. I know we went really in depth here, but honestly wide open in most realistic situations. The bokeh looks good, very good even for zoom lenses, which sometimes have a few more issues than primes do. The Leica has 9 rounded blades, but they managed to get 11 into the Lumix 24-70. In all honesty though, it doesn't really make that big of a difference to my eye, but I guess side by side the 24-70 certainly does seem to have slightly rounder bokeh when stopped down. It also should be noticed that the Leica stops down to f16, whereas the full frame Lumix goes down to f22. The The Leica at 10mm flares a bit, but it's honestly pretty well controlled with decent contrast and only a few small little bitty flare elements. When the light source is just out of frame, there's a little green spot that sneaks in though. Good stuff for the most part. Zooming in, you can see the green and blue flare elements intensify at certain focal lengths, making the strength of the flare just a little inconsistent, but that's mostly true for most zoom lenses. 25mm, there's a slight burst of light when the light is just out of the frame, and contrast is slightly lower here than at wider angles. Still, a mostly decent performance, and creatively, I like the flare quite a bit here. The Lumix 24-70 right off the bat has some stuff going on. First, even though we are wide open, we get a bit of a Sunstar effect from the bokeh. The second thing I noticed was the flare elements are a lot more saturated and colorful, with blue, green, and red elements being pretty pronounced at 24mm. It also looks like contrast is a little lower compared to the 10-25, but that could just be how I set up this test. Zooming in, the flare stays relatively consistent with changes here and there, but the contrast around the light source and the size and quality of the flare elements, they're roughly the same throughout the zoom range. I should say anytime the light does go out of the frame, you are introduced to a similar burst of light or glare, but again, it's slightly worse here than on the 10-25. I think the 10-25 technically is better, but I think they are both very good and have some interesting properties when compared to other lenses. So yeah, they're generally pretty clean, pretty well controlled for most aberrations, and that includes flare.
Although in some really niche situations with bright points of light, I don't know if this is in flare or bokeh or what, but you can see these sort of like bubble circle things around points of light at certain focal lengths, which is, I don't know, I don't really care, but some people might really not enjoy this aspect of the lens.
The 10-25, as expected, has some pretty good Sunstars, I think. You guys know I don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to good Sunstars, but there are a lot of beams, and that does really well, and they're really defined at f/16, so there's that. The 24-70 with its extra blades should have even more Sunstar beams, but, well, even if it does have more, the quality of this just doesn't seem nearly as good as the Leica. The beams here have a weird pattern, they're not super long, and I don't know, they just sort of are bunched up in pairs that seems kind of off to me. It's probably a fine Sunstar, but I think most people would probably gravitate towards the 10-25 if all you care about is Sunstars for some reason. So I thought this might be an interesting test for a few reasons, because we're testing these lenses and the cameras at the end of the day, and one of the biggest things for a lot of videographers doing weddings, things like that, is the low light performance. And this is about as low light, probably way more low light than you would ever want to get with either of these cameras. But the reason I test it is because there's a lot of differences here, more than in most of the categories. See, the GH5 is sort of relatively terrible in low light. We're shooting in vlog, by the way, just to make things as hard on these cameras as possible. The GH5 native ISO of 400, tiny little micro four thirds sensor, but we've got a pretty fast piece of glass on there. So that's gonna let us get almost twice, 1.5 times more light than the f2.8 of the S5 with the 24-70. What the S5 has, though, is a dual native ISO sensor, which means it has that base ISO we talked about in the GH5, but it has one at 640 and one at 4000. Now, I know the 4000 one's not supposed to be quite as good, but, it's definitely going to be better than not having one at all. People also say that full-frame cameras are better, just as a general rule, in low light than micro four thirds cameras. I'm not really sure I believe this because, take a DSLR, a full-frame one from 10 years ago, and people are saying never use this over ISO 600, So the idea that a full-frame camera is intrinsically better in low light, I think, is a myth, but it might have some grain of truth to it. We graded this with the nicest LUT, but let's take that away now just to see the raw, nasty, terrible vlog footage. And yeah, which one's better? Which one has more color shift? Which one has better details still, assuming I'm in focus at all? And of course, which one has the better noise performance? I'm going to be really interested to see which one of these cameras and lens combinations do better in low light. In these low light tests, it's not super clear right away which one wins, but let's be honest, if you look closely, the S5 does pull ahead. Even at the much higher ISO value, the noise is slightly better. The color shifts are less extreme, my jacket remaining red on the S5, but shifting towards a pink color on the GH5. The detail is better too, with some parts of my jacket being lost in some of the darker areas of the image. Still, I think the GH5 puts up a decent fight, honestly, for a camera that is 3+ years old with a single gain micro four thirds sensor. Honestly, I used to think the vlogging tests some people do were kind of pointless, but this is a decent way to test a lot of stuff we've looked at already and a few things we haven't. We can see the colors, the bokeh, as well as some things like how the focal length works, the stabilization, and the autofocus even, which was set to face tracking in those shots. Let's be honest though, both of these lenses are way too heavy to vlog with on the regular, and you're gonna get pretty tired pretty quickly. The 24-70 to me feels way more unbalanced because of the light camera body than the GH5 plus 10-25 does. And in general, the GH5 is much better for vlogging with this lens. The 10mm focal length works really well. The background is acceptably blurred, the stabilization is slightly better, minus the occasional wobble, and the minimum focus distance is better for getting close to the camera on certain occasions. Still, I don't think I would recommend vlogging with either setup. Man, wouldn't it be nice if Panasonic had some dedicated fast-ish wide-angle prime, like an 8-10mm f1.4-2 range? Micro Four Thirds really does have so much more unexplored design space with, fast wide-angle primes, a partner to the Leica 10-25, f1.7, things like that. So I think those weirdo lenses that you can't really get on other systems is something that Panasonic should really look into more. Anyway, let's stop talking about that and get back to the video. In summary, these are both super usable, super nice lenses, and it's actually really, really hard for me to choose which one is best. I think I'm gonna keep both of them at the end of the day for different types of projects. I've even used both on one project recently, and they cut together pretty well. So the Leica is very versatile. I find that the 20mm full frame wide angle is really handy, and 24mm often seems too tight for some stuff I end up shooting. I also really appreciate the minimum focus on this lens. I did a lot of food photography recently, and I planned on using the S5 for its slightly better megapixel count, but found that it just really couldn't focus close enough with the 24-70 to really make it worth it. So thankfully I had my GH5 and 10-25 on standby, ready to go, and the vast majority of those shots were taken with it and the Leica 10-25 that day. That being said, there are many circumstances where I would pick the S5 and 24-70 instead. Something like an event or a wedding. Sometimes you really don't want to be right in the action, say like a first dance or something like that. So reaching out to 70mm as opposed to 50 is quite the difference, and I can really see the better low light on the sensor being a big selling point for this camera lens setup. Probably has about a stop and a half, maybe 2 stops better low light than the GH5. You also get blurrier backgrounds wide open with this lens at equivalent focal lengths, and you can go all the way into 70mm, which really lets you blow out some distracting backgrounds for a really nice look. So I obviously can't tell you for sure which one to buy, or if you should sell the GH5 to get the S5 or anything like that, but hopefully this video helps you decide and make the right decision for yourself. I thought this was a cool idea for a video, and pitting a camera and a lens together is, kind of a weird idea, but I don't know, what did you guys think? Would you like this comparison, or would you rather me just do straight up reviews or stick within a single system? I don't know, let me know, and while you're down there, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe as well to get notified when my new videos go live. My name is Rhett Thompson, and if you hit subscribe, I will see you in the next video.